My name is Ilara. In my family, we didn't measure love in hugs or kind words. We measured it in brushstrokes, composition, and the prestige of the galleries that hung our name on their ivory walls. My parents were titans of the neoclassical scene, and my brother, Julian, was their prodigy, the golden child who could do no wrong as long as his shadows were blended perfectly. I was the anomaly. I painted with raw, jagged textures and neon hues that bled into the canvas like open wounds. To them, my work wasn't art, it was an infection. They didn't just reject me, they tried to incinerate my soul to make room for Julian's spotlight. Today, I am the ghost they think they laid to rest in a backyard bonfire. But silence is a powerful canvas, and I've spent 8 years preparing to paint the final stroke of their downfall. The smell of burning turpentine and linseed oil is something you never truly forget. It's sweet, chemical, and suffocating. The smell of a funeral pyre for things that never got to live. I stood by the French doors of our estate's studio, my hands trembling as I watched the orange glow reflecting off the glass. My father, a man whose hands were usually steady enough to paint a miniature on a grain of rice, was feeding the flames with a methodical, cold efficiency. My mother stood beside him, her silk scarf fluttering in the evening breeze, her eyes devoid of anything resembling maternal warmth. "It's for your own good, Ilara," my mother said, not looking at me. She was watching a 3-foot canvas, a portrait of a woman screaming in violet and electric blue, shrivel into a black husk. This amateur trash is an embarrassment to the Thorn name. We have a reputation to uphold, especially now that Julian's solo exhibition at the Met has been confirmed." "That was my work for the scholarship application," I whispered, my voice breaking. 3 years of my life. You burned the only portfolio I had." "Portfolio?" my father scoffed, tossing my palette into the embers. The dried paint hissed and popped like tiny firecrackers. "This isn't art, it's an eyesore. It's a tantrum on a canvas. We've poured every cent of the family trust into Julian's opening. We can't have critics finding out that our daughter produces this. It would suggest a flaw in the bloodline." "You gave him everything," I said, the heat from the fire stinging my cheeks. "The trust, the connections, the studio space. I painted in the basement under a single bulb, while he got the skylights." "Because he has the gift, Ilara." My father turned on me then, his face contorted in a mask of professional disgust. "Julian understands form. He understands tradition. You're just a girl with too much paint and not enough discipline. If you want to play at being an artist, do it on someone else's dime. We've sold the cottage in Provence to fund Julian's marketing campaign. There is no room left for a hobbyist. Pack your bags. If you can't contribute to the Thorn legacy, you have no place in this house." I didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with statues. I walked upstairs to the room they had begrudgingly let me occupy, grabbed a single backpack, and took the one thing they had missed, a small, scratched palette knife I'd hidden under my floorboards. As I walked down the long gravel driveway, the silhouette of the Thorn mansion loomed behind me like a tomb. I didn't look back at the fire. I didn't cry. I simply looked at my hands stained with the soot of my own dreams and made a silent vow. "You want tradition?" I thought. "I'll give you a revolution." The next 8 years were a blur of hunger, grit, and the kind of obsession that turns a person into a weapon. I lived in a loft in Brooklyn that leaked when it rained and froze when it snowed. I worked 3 jobs, waitressing until dawn, setting sets for local theaters, and cleaning the brushes of artists who were half as talented as I was. Every penny I made went to pigment. Every spare second went to the canvas. I stopped being Ilara Thorne. That girl had died in a backyard bonfire. I became Vesper. I started painting on the streets, using the city's grime and discarded metal as my base. My work was loud, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. I used the textures of my own struggle, the sandpaper of poverty, the metallic tang of anger. I didn't use brushes, I used the palette knife I'd saved and my own bare hands. Success didn't come with a knock on the door, it came with a whisper in the dark. A gallery owner in Soho saw a mural I'd painted on a condemned building. He didn't see amateur trash, he saw the future. He saw a soul that had been forged in fire and tempered in ice. Within 3 years, Vesper was a name that made the elite of the art world tremble with excitement. My identity remained a mystery. I never appeared at my own openings. I never did interviews. I let the work speak, the raw, bleeding violet and neon energy that my parents had tried to cremate. Meanwhile, the Thorne legacy was crumbling. I watched from the shadows as Julian's meticulous career plateaued. The critics grew bored of his polished, lifeless imitations of the masters. My parents, in their desperation to maintain their lifestyle, began selling off their collection, piece by piece. They mortgaged the estate to fund Julian's failing gallery. They were drowning in a sea of ivory tower debt, clinging to a name that no longer held any weight. 8 years to the day I was exiled, I sat in a sleek black limousine outside the Sotheby's auction house in London. I was wearing a suit of midnight blue velvet, my hair pulled back, my eyes sharp. Inside, my parents were sitting in the front row, clutching their last remaining asset, a rare 17th century landscape they had inherited from my grandfather. It was their last hope. If it didn't sell for a record price, the Thorne estate would be seized by the bank within the week. They didn't know that the bank had already sold their debt. They didn't know that the mysterious benefactor who had bought their gallery out of foreclosure was the same person who had requested that their landscape be the centerpiece of tonight's auction. And they certainly didn't know that the artist they called amateur trash was currently the highest valued living painter in the room. The auctioneer cleared his throat, the gavel poised like a judge's hammer. Ladies and gentlemen, we move now to the final lot of the evening, a rare masterpiece from the Thorne collection. But before we begin the bidding, I have been asked to introduce a special guest, the person who has recently acquired the Thorne Gallery and will be presiding over the future of this collection. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. My parents turned in their seats, their faces etched with a desperate, pathetic hope. They expected a savior. They expected a peer. I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my heels on the marble echoing like a heartbeat. The room went silent. I saw my mother's hand fly to her throat. I saw my father's jaw drop, his face turning a sickly, translucent white. I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of them. I looked down at the people who tried to burn my future to ash. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father," I said, my voice as cold as a frozen lake. "I heard you were looking for someone with a bit of talent." I turned to the auctioneer, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. "Cancel the auction for the landscape. I'm not buying it. I already own the ground it's sitting on." The Thorne legacy wasn't burning tonight. It was being foreclosed, and I was the one holding the match.
The silence in the Sotheby's auction hall was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive dust and the collective gasp of London's elite. My mother's face, usually a mask of porcelain perfection, was cracking. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a ghost that had walked out of the fire and started breathing gold. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice trembling like a faulty string on a violin. This is some kind of mistake. You're Vesper, the woman who painted the Neon Grief series that sold for $12 million in Tokyo? The amateur trash grew up, Mother, I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room. I didn't look at her, I looked at my father. He was staring at my hands, the hands he had once said lacked the discipline for true art. Now, those hands owned his debt. "The Thorn Gallery is no longer yours," I continued, stepping closer to them. "The mortgage on the estate was sold to a private equity firm 6 months ago. I am the sole director of that firm. Technically, you are trespassing on my property every minute you spend in that house." Julian, who had been sitting paralyzed next to them, finally found his voice. It was high and shrill, the sound of a spoiled child losing his favorite toy. "You can't do this! That gallery is my legacy! My exhibition is scheduled for next month!" "Your exhibition was canceled an hour ago, Julian," I said, turning to him. "I reviewed your new portfolio. It's stagnant, it's derivative, it's exactly what Father taught you to be, a copy of a copy. It has no market value." My father stood up, his face a bruised shade of purple. "You're doing this out of spite. You're destroying a century of reputation because we tried to give you a reality check." "I'm doing this out of business, Father, but I'm willing to offer a settlement. You owe approximately $4 million in liquidated debts. I will wipe those debts clean on one condition." I saw the spark of greed return to their eyes. It was pathetic. They were ready to negotiate before they even knew the terms. "What is it?" my mother asked, leaning forward. "A percentage of your future sales? A public reconciliation?" "No," I smiled, and it felt like a blade. "I need staff for my new experimental studio in the East End. I need people to prep canvases, scrub floors, and mix pigments. I need 3 assistants who understand tradition and discipline. You, Mother, and Julian will work for me for 1 year. You will live in the basement quarters, just as I did. If you miss a single day, or if the floors aren't spotless, I initiate the immediate eviction and seizure of the Thorn estate." The room erupted in whispers, the titans of neoclassicism working as manual laborers for the Vesper. It was the ultimate humiliation, a living installation of their own failure. "You want us to be servants?" Julian gasped, his face pale. "I want you to be useful," I replied. "Something you've never been. You start tomorrow at 6 a.m. Bring your own brushes. You'll be cleaning mine." The first week at the studio was a study in psychological warfare. I had taken an old industrial warehouse, cold, echoing, and smelling of raw iron, and turned it into my workspace. While I stood on a hydraulic lift attacking a 20-foot canvas with layers of jagged electric orange and charcoal, my parents were on their knees below me. My father, the man who once dined with ambassadors, was currently scrubbing the industrial floor, his knuckles raw from the lye. My mother was relegated to the pigment room, grinding raw minerals into dust, a tedious, back-breaking task that left her silk-soft hands stained with permanent indigo. But it was Julian who suffered the most. I made him stand in front of his own masterpieces, the ones I had bought back from the bargain bins of failing galleries, and paint over them with white primer. One by one, I made him erase his own history. "It hurts, doesn't it?" I asked, looking down from my lift as he stood over a portrait of our grandfather, his brush trembling as he applied the white gesso. "You're a monster, Ilara," he hissed, tears of frustration blurring his vision. "You're destroying art." "I'm destroying an ego, Julian," I said, jumping down from the lift. I took the brush from his hand and made a sharp, violent stroke across the canvas. "This wasn't art. This was a lie. You didn't paint this because you had something to say. You painted it because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't please Father. You've spent 28 years being a puppet. I'm giving you the chance to be a person. By making me a janitor? By making you see the work," I said, pointing to the raw materials on the table. "Art isn't the gala, it isn't the champagne or the critics. It's the grit under your fingernails. It's the moment you realize that the fire doesn't just destroy, it purifies." My father approached me, his back stooped, his pride leaking out of him like old oil. "The critics are calling, Ilara. They've heard whispers about our arrangement. They want an interview. They want to know why the Thorne family is suddenly behind Vesper's curtain." "Tell them the truth, Father." I wiped a streak of neon violet across my cheek. "Tell them you're finally learning the difference between an amateur and a professional. Tell them that talent isn't inherited, it's survived." I walked back to my canvas, leaving them in the shadows of the warehouse. I could feel their resentment, thick and bitter as old turpentine. But beneath it, I felt something else. For the first time, my father wasn't looking at my work with disgust. He was looking at it with a terrifying, silent awe. He was finally seeing the value of the daughter he had tried to burn, and he was starting to realize that the fire he started 8 years ago hadn't just consumed my paintings, it had fueled the engine that was now crushing him. The warehouse was a cathedral of hollow echoes and the sharp, chemical scent of fresh acrylic. My family had been working for me for 3 months, and the cracks in their refined facades were widening into canyons. My mother's hands were permanently stained with cobalt. My father's back was permanently stooped from moving heavy crates. But Julian was vibrating with a silent, poisonous resentment. I watched him through the glass partition of my private mezzanine. He wasn't scrubbing the floors today. He was standing in front of my latest unfinished work, The Phoenix's Ledger. It was a chaotic, visceral explosion of deep crimson and metallic gold, textured with real ash from the very fireplace where they had burned my dreams 8 years ago. "It's breathtaking, isn't it, Julian?" I said, my voice dropping from the speakers in the studio. He jumped, his hand twitching near the canvas. "It's aggressive, Ilara, as usual." "It's worth $5 million in pre-sales," I countered, walking down the spiral staircase. "And I've been invited to showcase it at the opening of the new National Modern Wing. The gala is in 2 days. The critics are calling it the defining moment of the decade. They say Vesper has finally captured the soul of survival." I saw his jaw tighten. I saw the way his eyes lingered on the brushwork, the raw, untamed energy he could never replicate. He was a man drowning, and I had just shown him a life raft made of gold. That night, I didn't leave the studio. I hid in the darkroom, watching the security feed on my tablet. At 2 a.m., the service elevator groaned. Julian entered, carrying a large roll of blank canvas and a set of professional forgery tools. He didn't just steal the painting, he did something much more Julian. He spent 4 hours meticulously copying the central motif of the Phoenix's ledger onto a smaller canvas, using the high-grade pigments I had taught my mother to grind. He was trying to create a lost study, a piece he could claim he painted years ago, proving that he was the original inspiration for the Vesper style. He worked with a feverish intensity I had never seen from him. For the first time, he wasn't painting for father, he was painting for his life. But he was blinded by his own ego. He didn't notice the microscopic details I had embedded in the crimson paint. The day of the National Modern Wing Gala arrived. The elite of the art world were there, sipping champagne and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the mysterious Vesper. My parents were there too, dressed in rented formal wear, standing as my assistants. They looked like ghosts at their own funeral. Suddenly, the crowd shifted. At the far end of the hall, near the entrance, a commotion broke out. Julian had arrived, but not as a guest. He had a small framed canvas under his arm, draped in black velvet. "I have an announcement," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a manic edge. The cameras turned toward him. "The world has been deceived. Vesper claims to be a revolutionary, but her style, her raw energy, was stolen from me. I painted this 8 years ago, before she was even a name in the streets." He whipped away the velvet. The crowd gasped. It was a stunning piece, a vibrant, blood-red sun rising over a field of ash. It looked exactly like a precursor to my grand masterpiece. My father's eyes widened with a mix of shock and a sudden, desperate hope. If Julian was the original, the Thorn name could be restored. They could sue me for the rights to the Vesper brand. They could take it all back. "Is this true, Vesper?" a reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward me. I walked toward Julian, my expression unreadable. I looked at the painting, then at his sweating, triumphant face. "It's a beautiful piece, Julian. The composition is identical to the one in my studio. But tell me, if you painted this 8 years ago, how did you manage to use pigment X24? The room went silent. Julian blinked. "What? It's just red paint." "No," I said, turning to the crowd. "Pigment X24 is a synthetic, high-stability acrylic I developed myself in my laboratory last month. It doesn't exist on the commercial market. It contains a unique molecular marker, a fluorescent isotope that only shows up under ultraviolet light." I signaled to the gallery technicians. The house lights dimmed, and the massive UV spotlights designed for modern installations swung toward Julian's painting. The canvas erupted in a glowing neon green pattern that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. But it wasn't just a glow. In the center of his original masterpiece, hidden within the layers of red, were the words I had painted onto the base of my canvas before he arrived. "Property of Vesper, stolen by a hobbyist." The gasps from the crowd were deafening. The camera flashes became a strobe light of public execution. Julian looked down on his glowing hands, stained with the same isotope, and realized he had walked right into a molecular trap. You set me up," he whispered, the canvas slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. "You set yourself up, Julian," I said, stepping over his original work. "You were so desperate to be a genius that you forgot to be an artist. You can't steal a soul. You can only reveal your own lack of one." I looked at my parents. My mother was weeping, her face buried in her ink-stained hands. My father looked like a man who had finally seen the sun and been blinded by it. He realized that Julian wasn't a prodigy, and I wasn't an amateur. I was the master, and he was the one who had taught his son to lie. The Thorn legacy didn't just crumble, it turned into a joke. The headlines the next morning wouldn't be about the Thorn family's return, they would be about the forger in the basement. Julian was ruined, but for me, the canvas was finally clean.
The Thorn estate had never looked more like a museum than it did on the day of its foreclosure auction. I had ordered the velvet curtains to be stripped, exposing the faded patches on the wallpaper where portraits of great men had hung for a century. The heavy, gilded furniture had been dragged into the center of the grand ballroom, numbered and tagged like cattle. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a collection of lots, a catalog of a dying dynasty. My parents and Julian stood in the foyer, dressed in the last of their decent clothes, wool coats that smelled of mothballs, and a desperate, clinging dignity. They watched as wealthy strangers, many of whom they had once snubbed at galas, wandered through their private rooms, touching the mahogany and whispering about the spectacular fall of the Thorn name. "You're really doing it," my father said. His voice was no longer the thunderous roar that had commanded my childhood. It was hollow, like wind blowing through an empty cave. The fire had gone out of him, replaced by a cold, gray realization. "You're selling the floorboards where you took your first steps? You're selling the history of your own blood." "I'm selling a mausoleum, Father," I said, not looking up from the digital ledger on my tablet. I felt a strange, clinical detachment. "This house died the night you burned my work. You just didn't notice the smell of the corpse until the bank sent the notice. I'm simply the undertaker." The ballroom was packed. The elite of the art world had come not just to buy, but to witness the final public stroke of Vesper's masterpiece. I took the stage, not as a daughter seeking reconciliation, but as the auctioneer of my own trauma. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice amplified by the cold, unforgiving acoustics of the hall. "Today we are not just selling antiques, we are selling a curated lie. Lot 1, the Thorn Library, 10,000 volumes of theory that failed to produce a single original thought. Lot 2, the studio of the prodigy, complete with the very easels that stood idle while I painted in the cellar. And finally, Lot 3, the Thorn Mansion itself." The bidding was swift and brutal. I watched my mother's face as her favorite Louis XIV vanity table was sold to a tech mogul's 20-year-old daughter. I watched Julian flinch as his first award-winning canvas, the one my father had spent a fortune in donations to secure a prize for, was sold to a local cafe owner for the price of its frame. Every strike of the gavel was a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. By the end of the hour, the house was empty. The echoes were the only thing left of the Thorn legacy. My parents and Julian were huddled together in the vast, hollow ballroom, looking small and fragile against the scale of the space they no longer owned. I stepped down from the podium and walked over to them. The sunlight was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, the last remains of their world. "It's over," Julian whispered, staring at the rectangular patch of dust on the floor where his primary easel had stood for a decade. "We have nothing. No name, no house, no future. You've erased us as if we were a bad sketch on a cheap canvas." "I haven't erased you, Julian," I said, pulling 3 thick, cream-colored envelopes from my jacket. I held them out, but I didn't let them take them immediately. "I've unframed you. For 30 years, you've lived inside a border that Father painted for you. You were a prodigy because he told you so. I was an amateur because he needed me to be a shadow to your light. But the frame is gone now. The gallery is closed." I handed each of them an envelope. Inside was a modest sum of money, a fraction of what I had made from a single Vesper sale, but enough to change their lives if they chose to. "What is this?" my mother asked, her eyes red and raw. "Is this your final insult? A tip for your assistance?" "It's a scholarship," I replied, looking directly at Julian. This is for a real art school in the Midwest, a place where the name Thorn means absolutely nothing. There, no one will care about your pedigree. They won't care about your father's connections. You'll have to start from the very first line. If you have a soul buried under all that white primer, you'll find it there. If not, at least you'll learn how to be an honest worker. I turned to my father. He looked at the check in his trembling hand. And you taught me that art is about power, about who gets to hold the brush and who has to clean it. You were wrong. Art is about truth, even the ugly, neon, jagged kind. Use this money to buy a small cottage in the country. Stop trying to be a titan of the scene. Paint the landscape as it actually is, with all its mud and imperfections, not as you want the critics to see it. Stop being a thorn and try being a human. Why? My father asked, his voice cracking. After the bonfire? After we threw you out with nothing but the clothes on your back? Why give us a single cent? Because an artist knows when a piece is finished. The Vengeance series is complete. If I let you starve, I'm just a mirror of your own cruelty. I'd be painting with your palette. But if I give you a blank canvas, I'm giving you the one thing you never gave me, a choice. I stood at the top of the gravel driveway, the same one I had walked down 8 years ago with the smell of my own burning dreams in my hair. The sun was setting behind the estate, casting a long golden shadow that stretched towards the gates. Behind me, the movers were carrying out the last crate. In front of me, the city was waking up, its lights beginning to twinkle, 1,000 tiny sparks of neon violet, electric blue, and a crimson that didn't come from a tube, but from the heart. I pulled my old, scratched palette knife from my pocket. It was the only relic of my past I'd kept. I didn't need it for protection anymore. I didn't even need it to scrape the paint. I tossed it into the tall grass by the gate. My name is Alara. I am no longer a daughter of a dynasty, and I am no longer a ghost of a fire. I am the light that remains when the lies have burned away. And for the first time in my life, the world is exactly the color I want it to be.